Hi everyone, welcome to the MSU Science Festival. We're gonna give everyone a minute or two to join in and then start on our fermentation in a bag experiment and talk about Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center. So Alana and Lucas, I think you can start.
Wonderful.
Awesome. So kick things off. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Grass to Gas, an official event of the Michigan State University Science Festival. My name is Lucas. I'm an undergraduate at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I am here representing the Wisconsin Energy Institute and the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center.
And hi, everyone. My name is Alana Rapp. I'm also a student at UW-Madison, and I work with Lucas at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And I'm really excited to be here with you all today.
So Grass to Gas is a fermentation experiment in which we'll answer the question, how do you run cars on plants? Spoiler alert, it can be done, and it's already being done all over the world. But before we get to that, let me just give some background on the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center, who we are here representing. The GLBRC is a U.S. Department of Energy funded bioenergy research center led by the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Here, over 400 researchers from many universities, including Michigan State, work on developing sustainable biofuels and bioproducts made from dedicated energy crops. And our goal is simply to produce biofuels and bioproducts that are economically viable and environmentally sustainable. And we're going to talk about what exactly that means later in this presentation. So here's our game plan for today. We're going to give you some context for this experiment and just review some scientific concepts that are important for understanding it. And then we're going to review the materials you'll need for this experiment. We'll set it up, record our observations and results, and then talk about them. And then we'll finish off with a Q&A in case you guys have any questions. And if you have the PDF with instructions to this activity, you could feel free to pull that out and reference it as we go along.
So have you guys maybe seen one of these in the last week or had something delivered by them? It's fairly likely that you have. So all of these forms of transportation have to run on something, right? They are fueled by an energy source. Most commonly, these fuels are derived from petroleum. It's used to make gasoline and diesel for cars and trucks, and other more energy-dense fuels for planes and ships, as well as many other products like tires, medicine, plastic, and fabrics like polyester. But petroleum leads to the release of carbon dioxide into the environment as it's being burned. Every gallon of gasoline burned releases about 20 pounds of CO2 into the atmosphere. The release of CO2 is problematic because it is a greenhouse gas. So to understand CO2's role as a greenhouse gas, we must first understand how our planet receives heat energy in the first place. So the sun is the source of heat energy received by the Earth. Sunlight shines on the planet, and in the form of light waves, it transfers heat to it. You can feel it yourself on a hot summer day when you're standing in the sun. Not all of the sun rays that reach the Earth's surface, however, are absorbed by it. Some of the sun's energy is also radiated back into space in the form of infrared waves. Many of these reflected rays will make it all the way back out into outer space, while others will stay trapped by the gases in our atmosphere, creating a sort of insulative layer around the Earth that keeps it warm. As a natural phenomenon, the greenhouse gas effect is necessary for life on Earth. However, certain gases like CO2 magnify this greenhouse gas effect by increasing the amount of reflected rays that get trapped, thus warming the Earth to an unnatural and unsafe degree. So here you can see two diagrams depicting the difference between the effects of the natural greenhouse gas effect and the one that is more of a human influence. On a cool fall night, for example, you might want to have a blanket to stay warm under, but 5 blankets would become too hot. A similar phenomenon is going on here. With the increase in greenhouse gases, Earth is getting too hot, and we can observe warming trends occurring all over the world. So global temperatures are rising, as is shown in red on this map. The more red an area, the faster that it has been warming since 1990. And as expected, CO2 has also been rising since 1990 in parallel with the rise in temperatures. So the two are linked. An increase in CO2 emissions is directly causing the increase in world temperatures and the associated problems. So going back to the beginning of our presentation, it is petroleum and fossil fuels that are the main sources of CO2 in the atmosphere. And as we discussed, It's cars, trucks, planes, and other forms of transportation that are a major user of fossil fuels and are thus responsible for a large portion of the greenhouse gas emissions that we see. So a major challenge we're facing right now is figuring out how we can address this issue. And one method researchers are working on is developing fuels that are made out of plants instead of petroleum.
So now enter biofuels. Fossil fuels, the normal kinds of fuels that we use to fuel our vehicles, and biofuels both serve the same function. They both provide fuel for our vehicles, and they both emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as a byproduct. But the way biofuels differ is that they're made from plants that help cycle the carbon dioxide instead of just leaving it in the atmosphere to accumulate and accumulate like fossil fuels do. So how does this work exactly? As I'm sure some of you guys know, plants undergo the process of photosynthesis, in which they take up CO2 and water from the atmosphere in order to produce the things that they and many other organisms need to survive. And it's this process of photosynthesis that allows biofuels to be so environmentally friendly. So here we have plants that are taking up CO2 constantly from the atmosphere. Then those plants are made into biofuels. And then the burning of those biofuels emit carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, only to be taken up again by those plants. So again, biofuels allow for CO2 to be cycled continuously instead of just leaving them in the atmosphere to keep building up. So then that begs the question, how do we make biofuels from plants? Unfortunately, we can't just stick plants into our gas tanks and hope they work, right? We need to find ways to chemically convert plants into biofuels. So just take a minute and see if you can figure out what this is. You'll see the little 5 micrometer marking on the bottom right-hand corner of this image, indicating that this is a very tiny, small thing. So just take a second and see if you can identify it. So this thing is baker's yeast. It's a little microbe that we've been using for thousands and thousands of years to make things like bread and wine and beer. And the reason we can do that is because yeast ferments sugar. So let's take a closer look at this process. The way fermentation works is that glucose, or sugar, is fed to yeast, which breaks it down and produces ethanol, which is a biofuel, and carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Our task today is going to be to figure out which food the yeast can ferment the best.
So now we will begin the experiment portion of this lesson. For your fermentation experiment, you will need the
Alana, so I think your video is cut off. I mean, your sound cut off. Alana, can you hear me? Alana, I think your voice cut off.
Adrianna, could you send Alana a direct message and see if she sees that?
I'm unfortunately unable. Do you have her phone number?
Yeah, I could text
Can you
her.
guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry.
No
How
worries.
long was I
It's
cut
no
out for?
problem.
Okay. How long was I cut out for? Where should I begin?
Could you just begin at the beginning of the experiment?
Okay. Yes.
And you guys
Okay,
can follow along
so
with me while
here.
Alana's explaining it. Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so sorry about that. So now we'll begin the experiment portion of this lesson. For your fermentation experiment, you will need the following materials: baker's yeast, warm water, 1 teaspoon measuring spoons, something to measure 1/4 cup of water with, feedstocks, which I'll explain in a moment what exactly we mean by that, resealable, snack size, sort of small Ziploc bags, and paper towels in case there's a slight spill. So feedstock, what exactly do we mean by that? So feedstock is the term we use to describe what we are feeding the yeast. As Lucas said, yeast are tiny living microorganisms, so they need to eat to survive. And as we saw in the fermentation process diagram, it is the yeast eating the feedstock that allows for the reaction to occur that creates biofuel. So here we have an example of feedstocks that you can use if you have them around your house. So sugar is the one that we recommend everyone use, just sort of regular granulated sugar that you would use in baking. Then cornmeal, if you have that available to you, is another great one to try. Then sawdust is probably a little less common, but maybe if you have that, or sort of like leaves and stems that you can get from your yard that can be ground up a bit. And also cereal, if you have any sort of sugary cereals, especially around, you could try grinding those up. So feel free to be creative. If you have any other ideas, you could use different things as well. So go ahead and grab those now if you don't have them in front of you already. And just keep in mind that you definitely don't need to have all of these, but having a few of them is good because we're trying to compare the efficacy of the different types of feedstock. All right, I'll begin explaining the experimental setup. And if you are still grabbing your feedstock, that's totally fine. But I'll leave this on the screen for a moment, and it's fairly straightforward to follow. But okay, so now that we've assembled our materials, let's set our experiment up. First step is to take 1 teaspoon of a feedstock. We recommend starting with sugar, and put that into your Ziploc bag that you are going to have the reaction occurring in. And Lucas is explaining it now, so feel free to watch his video to see him do the experiment. So then after that, you'll take 1 teaspoon of yeast and also add that into the same bag that you just put in your feedstock to, your sugar in this case. So take 1 teaspoon of that yeast and add it to the sugar. And then the last step is to take 1/4 cup of water, of warm water. So you can basically just turn your sink faucet to about as warm as it'll go, or a little less, depending on how hot your sink faucet gets. And fill up 1/4 cup of water and put that into the same bag as the teaspoon of sugar and yeast. Now, once you do that, you'll want to seal the bag and make sure it's completely closed, and try and remove as much air in the process as you do that. So you can see Lucas is kind of making sure that the top part of that bag is flattened out so that there's not a bunch of air bubbles left trapped in it. And that way we can see when the reaction is occurring more easily. And then just seal that really well and kind of stir and mix up the bottom. You can kind of press on it with your fingers, try and make sure that the yeast, if it's clumped up, or the sugar can get evenly distributed around the bag. So now you will repeat this process with any other feedstocks that you have, and then put them out in front of you, and maybe have sort of a label for each of them. If you can put them on the bag itself with a marker, or you could also write it on a piece of paper, which we'll explain in a moment. So the big question that we're trying to answer with our experiment is, which feedstock will the yeast ferment the best? And what does ferment the best even mean? So that's something good to be thinking about as we talk about and go through the rest of the experiment. So, and also if you only had access to sugar, that's no problem. You can just focus on observing the effects of what's happening in that bag. So now let's make a hypothesis, an educated guess on what we believe the outcome of our experiment will be. So a common structure of hypotheses are the if-then statements. For example, if a bag with cornmeal puffs up more than a bag with leaves, then cornmeal ferments better than leaves. So in this case, in this hypothesis, the person is kind of estimating that puffing up more is equivalent to fermenting better, like we talked about before. What exactly does that mean? So that could be one way to take it. If you guys are not so sure exactly what fermenting better will look like right now, just do your best to say which of the bags you think will have the best reaction with this sort of if-then structure. So think about your hypothesis for a moment and write it down at the top of a piece of paper. And then you can divide the remaining part of that paper into as many sections as different feedstocks that you used, if you'd like, as a way of sort of labeling and organizing them. So then you can place the bag with the feedstock into the corresponding little quadrant here on your paper. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we are seeking to understand with our experiment is, what does ferment the best mean? Think if you have any ideas, and you can start writing down some observations of any changes that you're seeing that are happening in the bags. Yeah, and then we'll come back and make some more observations later. So go ahead, and if you had other feedstocks, finish filling those up, and we'll go from there.
So right now, after you set up your experiment, your yeast will be producing ethanol, which is the most common mass-produced biofuel. Out of all the gasoline we get at gas stations and everything, about 10% of it is always ethanol. And ethanol is produced from corn, which our research center does not study for a couple of reasons. First off, we've pretty much already got it figured out. As I've said, corn-based ethanol is already used all over the world. It's very widely implemented, and our research center wants to tackle challenges that haven't really been solved yet. Second, corn is food, and we don't want to take up valuable agricultural land with plants that could otherwise be used to feed people. So we want to focus on non-food crops that can be grown on non-agricultural lands. Lastly, it just takes a lot of energy to grow corn. Usually lots of fertilizer is involved. We want to seek out plants to produce biofuels that really don't take a lot of energy to grow. So now you might be noticing some things starting to happen in your bags. So now would be a good time to just pause for a minute and make some observations. And you could use each of the quadrants in your piece of paper, each representing one of the feedstocks. I see some raised hands. Are there any questions right now that we could answer as we go through this?
So I can't see the raise hands on participants. So if you actually have questions, can you please just use the Q&A to send them to us? Sorry about that. I can't exactly see who has their hand up. If Lucas, if you can allow the participant who has their raised hand to talk too.
Oh, all right. Okay, Aiden, I believe you were the one who had their hand raised. I just turned on talking permissions for you if you'd like to ask your question. If you don't want to ask it, that's no problem. We'll just take a little bit more time to write down some observations and maybe finish making our feedstocks and making our bags if we're not there yet.
Yeah, and again, if anyone has questions or wants to share their observations, please feel free to use the Q&A.
Just as a little hint as to what your bag might look like in a bit. So I started this before we began the presentation, and you can see there's a layer of bubbles on top, and the bag was completely flat before, and now it definitely has some gases that are filling it up. So that's kind of like what it'll start to look like once the reaction has progressed a bit. Okay, I think we'll move on. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A or to raise your hand, and we will allow you to unmute.
Okay, so let's start to answer this question of which feedstock is best for fermentation and what does it mean to ferment the best? So if you remember earlier in this presentation, I said that as a byproduct of fermentation, carbon dioxide is produced by the yeast. And that's the gas you're probably seeing in some of your bags. So the more inflated your bag is, the more CO2 is going to be in there, the more fermentation is happening as a result. And this has to do with what the yeast can and can't break down. It all depends on the chemical composition of all these feedstocks. So here's a little analogy to think about this better. Imagine if you tried to eat a whole raw potato. It would not be a good time. You wouldn't have fun. Your stomach would not be able to digest it very well. But if you diced and cooked that potato, you'd have a much easier time eating it. And the same goes for yeast. There are some things that are just too big for the yeast to break down. So we introduce these things called enzymes, which allow us to break these compounds down and make them more digestible. We could also add heat, which speeds up the process of chemical reactions. So looking at these different feedstocks, you'll see that sugar is just glucose. And if you remember on the slide about fermentation, that is the thing that yeast likes to ferment the best. It loves to eat glucose. And that's all that sugar is. It's just straight glucose. So you'll probably notice lots of gas forming in the bag containing sugar. And that's because the yeast just loves to ferment it. It can ferment it really well. And then cornmeal is basically a ton of glucose molecules strung together in these long chains. So same chemical composition as glucose, right? C6H12O6, as you could see on the slide. But they're attached together, so they're a little harder for the yeast to break down because these molecules are bigger. And then we have corn stover, and you'll notice it says C6H10O5, which is a slightly different chemical composition than glucose. So this feedstock is going to be even harder for that yeast to break down. You might be noticing even less gas forming in that bag. And then lastly, we have sawdust. Sawdust is all sorts of chemical compounds just kind of stuck together. There's lignin, there's cellulose, there's all sorts of things that the yeast really wants to stay away from and not ferment. So you might not notice any gas forming in your sawdust bag whatsoever. I'm not noticing any in mine right now. So yeast usually has a hard time fermenting sawdust because these molecules are very big, very variable. So this is just scratching the surface of biofuels and of fermentation. There's still so many questions that our research center is trying to answer. How do we pick plants that make the best biofuels? How do we know which plants make the best biofuels? How do we grow and cook those plants so that those biofuels or those biofuel crops can be digested really easily by the microbes? How do we choose the best microbes to ferment these things and turn them into biofuels? And even how do we genetically modify these microbes so that we can make them as efficient as possible? There's some really cool stuff going on at the GLBRC related to all these things. So that just about concludes the activity. We'll leave some time for you guys to continue writing observations down about your bags and asking any sorts of questions you have in the Q&A. Here's some emails that you could get in contact with if you have questions. And you could also go to www.glbrc.org if you want to learn more about the Great Lakes Bioenergy Research Center. So we'll stick around for a bit. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask away.
Thank you, Lucas and Alana. That was great. We had one question on Facebook is, if we're not studying corn, what are we studying?
So there are, we run other activities at the Wisconsin Energy Institute and the GLBRC involving all the different crops that can be used for biofuels. One of those crops is switchgrass. I know that's one that the GLBRC is studying really closely. I guess I'm drawing a blank on a couple of the other ones.
There's also, I was going to say there's energy sorghum is another one that's being looked at. And that's just a very fast growing and grows very large, very tall, I think up to like 15 to 20 feet or something. It's really a very large plant. And then also miscanthus is another one, I believe. So these are a couple examples of different types of plants that are a couple things are better about them than corn. So one, they don't take as much water and fertilizer to grow, as many resources. Two, they tend to have a lot deeper of roots. So corn doesn't have very deep roots. And so plants that have deeper roots are able to sequester that carbon in the soil and more of it in the soil and store that in their roots. And that is something that is very advantageous. And then also, they don't need to be replanted every year the way that corn does. And so they don't, get to be taken out of the ground and then the soil is stirred up and more carbon is released through that process, as happens with corn. And then also they can grow on marginal lands, which is something that the GLBRC is looking into, and not taking up, like Lucas was saying with corn, valuable sort of agricultural land that could be used to grow food, but instead could be grown sort of on like the dividers between highways and like sort of in between areas that are not something that we would use for food, for example. So we could use them for growing these plants for fuel instead.
And on the GLBRC website, you can see some pictures of how exactly these crops are studied. I think they're really cool. They have these giant fields with all these like square plots with all sorts of different possible biofuel crops growing under the same conditions. And you can just like walk between them and check out each individual crop and see how well each one grows in the same conditions. It's really cool to see just these massive fields with all sorts of crops on them.
Great question.
I had another question more on a broader scale of just, these biofuels and bioenergy. It's something that's being developed, but we know that climate is changing. And so what are other things until we have developed these biofuels really well to use them in everyday life or have cars run on them and trucks? What are other things that we can do to help on the individual levels, or things that maybe you do in your daily life?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So the first thing that I would think of is, renewable energies. There's a lot of other different options there that are being explored and being expanded. So solar and wind and hydro, for example. And I think that those are all really promising sources of energy that we should look into, furthering and investing into. And, if you can get solar panels on your roof, or obviously that's a pretty big investment and not available to everyone, but those are some different options that people look into, as well as just decreasing your overall energy use in the first place. So, if you can choose to use public transportation instead of driving, or biking rather, or walking rather, if that's a possibility for you, or carpooling with other people, any way that you can sort of decrease the amount of travel time spent in a car, especially when it's deriving its energy from fossil fuel based petroleum. Otherwise, there's lots of other small things you can do too in your life, like a whole range. For example, paying attention to what you buy and how far it had to travel to get to you, because that of course releases fossil fuels as well. So if you can buy food, for example, locally or more seasonally, so it doesn't need to be shipped from a very far away place that is warm when we are not, especially here in like Michigan, Wisconsin, Midwest, northern area. Yeah, Lucas, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's all very well said. Something I'd like to add just about promoting biofuel use as an individual. My dad, he runs a brewery, and they have all this leftover like fryer grease, and it's got all sorts of like vegetable oils in it. And what he does is he takes this leftover grease and he brings it to a farmer who converts that grease into biodiesel, and he uses that biodiesel for his truck. So biofuels aren't really something that's like just relegated to like scientists, right? It's something that we can access ourselves, and something we could do as individuals is find ways to connect restaurants where this vegetable oil is just being wasted with the people who can convert it into biofuels. And then there are all sorts of fuel converters that we could buy for our cars, so we could use that fuel in just the cars we already own instead of having to buy new cars that are better suited to biofuels. So even talking about biofuels, there's so many things that we could do on the individual level to reduce our carbon emissions.
That's great. Great answers. We're almost at time, but we have one more question. is yeast the most efficient organism for producing biofuels, or are there other microorganisms that you are testing?
There are definitely other microorganisms. I'm not sure exactly what they are, but GLBRC is very closely studying genetically modifying these microbes. So there are lots of kind of new microbes being developed that are really suited to biofuel production. It's not just yeast.
And I can add on that. So the other organism is Simomonas mobilis. And one thing that is big and also we're developing is you kind of have to pre-treat these plants. You just don't give them directly to the microbes. So kind of like the activity shows, the more broken down the plant is, if it's already sugar, instead of giving it the yeast sugar cane, it's easier to break it down. So we're GLBRC is also studying process yeast of breaking it down to breaking down the feedstocks to then help the microorganisms further produce the biofuels. So we're at time. The video will be posted also on our Facebook that I sent in the Q&A link to. And thank you all so much for attending. And thank you, Lucas and Alana, for the wonderful presentations. Feel free to email us with more questions. And if you want to learn more about GLBRC, visit our website.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.